He wasn't even on duty when he heard the desperate radio call. The static, crackled voice from the sky painted a picture of pure hell in a small, forgotten clearing in the Cambodian jungle code name Loc Ninh. The date was May 2, 1968. At the forward operating base in Loc Ninh, South Vietnam, Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez was enjoying a rare moment of respite. Wounded months earlier and still recovering, he was on light duty, his war-fighting days supposedly behind him, at least for now. He was in the mess hall, the humid air thick with the smell of coffee and canned food, when the distress call sliced through the morning routine. A 12-man Special Forces reconnaissance team, B-56, was in a world of trouble. They were surrounded, outnumbered at least 100 to 1, taking heavy casualties, and their escape route was cut off. The voice of the team leader, First Lieutenant Richard Moose Culland, was tight with controlled panic. They were taking fire from all sides. They needed immediate extraction. They needed a miracle. Roy Benavidez didn't hear a request for a miracle. He heard a call to duty. Without hesitation, without waiting for orders, he sprinted. He grabbed a medical kit, knowing men would be bleeding. He snatched a Bowie knife, a brutal, heavy blade he favored for close-quarters combat. He wasn't armed for a prolonged firefight. He was armed for a rescue. He wore no shirt, just his fatigue pants and boots. He ran to the helicopter pad where a Huey was spinning up, its rotors beginning to beat the air into a furious downdraft. The pilot, Major Larry McKibben, saw Benavidez and shook his head. It was a suicide mission. The landing zone was a meat grinder. Benavidez didn't argue. He just pointed to his ear, gestured wildly at the sky where the radio call had originated, and jumped aboard. He was going. There was no debate. What followed was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a 6-hour descent into a primordial nightmare of mud, blood, and fire. It was a testament to one man's indomitable will, a will so fierce it defied the very limits of human endurance. For 6 hours, Benavidez would become a one-man army, a whirlwind of violence and salvation, surviving 37 separate bullet and bayonet wounds, saving the lives of 8 fellow soldiers, and single-handedly fighting off elements of a North Vietnamese army battalion in brutal hand-to-hand combat. And when rescue finally came, his body was so shattered, so utterly mangled and lifeless in appearance that he was zipped into a body bag among the dead. It was there, in the sterile light of a field hospital, that the corpse suddenly stirred. Gathering the last vestige of his strength to spit in the face of a doctor, a final defiant act that proved the heart of a hero still beat inside. This is the true story the Pentagon once called impossible. But to understand the man who performed the impossible, one must first understand the crucible that forged him. Part 1. The Crucible of Cuero, a boy named Pete. Long before the jungles of Vietnam, there was the dusty, sun-baked soil of South Texas. Roy Benavidez was born on August 5, 1935, in Lindenau, a small farming community outside Cuero, Texas. His life began with tragedy and hardship, the very ingredients that would later forge an unbreakable spirit. His father, Salvador Benavidez, a Mexican-American farm worker, died of tuberculosis when Roy was 2. His mother, Teresa Perez, a Yaqui Indian, succumbed to the same disease just 4 years later. Orphaned at the age of 6, Roy and his younger brother, Roger, were sent to live with an uncle, a man who ruled with a harsh hand and little affection. The Benavidez boys' childhood was one of poverty and labor. Education was a luxury they could not afford. Survival was the only curriculum. Roy dropped out of school after the 7th grade to work full-time, picking cotton, shining shoes, hauling crops, any job that would put a few cents in his pocket. He was small for his age, but what he lacked in size he made up for in a fierce, almost feral determination. The other children, and even some adults, mocked him for his mixed heritage, calling him a dumb Mexican or a dirty Indian. The taunts stung, but they did not break him. They tempered him. He learned to fight, not for glory, but for respect. He developed a deep-seated resentment for bullies and a profound loyalty to those who were vulnerable. It was during these formative years that he earned the nickname that would stick with him for life. He admired the fearless, heroic cowboys he saw in the Saturday matinee westerns, particularly one named Pete. He started calling himself Roy Benavidez, and the name fit. It was simple, tough, and American. The shy, orphaned Roy was receding, and the resilient, scrappy Pete was emerging. At 17, with no prospects and a future that seemed to stretch only as far as the next cotton field, Benavidez did what many young men in his situation did. He joined the army. It was 1952, and the Korean War was raging, but for Benavidez, the motivation was less about patriotism and more about escape. The army promised 3 square meals a day, a bed, and a steady paycheck. It was a way out of Cuero and into a world where a man could be judged by his merits, not his last name. He enlisted on a Friday and left town on a Saturday, telling almost no one. He was starting over. Part 2, The Making of a Green Beret, from Paratrooper to Warrior. The army of the 1950s was a shock to the system for the young Texan. The rigid discipline, the constant drilling, the impersonal nature of it all was a world away from the unstructured hardship of his youth. But Benavidez found he was well suited to it. The physical demands were nothing compared to a day in the cotton fields. The clear chain of command and the ethos of mission first resonated with his own pragmatic worldview. He discovered something he had never truly had: a family. The men in his unit, his buddies, became the brothers he never had. He volunteered for the airborne, seeking the extra pay and the prestige that came with the silver wings. Jumping out of a perfectly good airplane terrified him, but the fear of being seen as weak was a greater motivator. He earned his parachutist badge and was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. He was a competent soldier, but he hadn't yet found his calling. He was just another paratrooper in a division full of them. That changed when he first saw them, the Green Berets. They were different. They carried themselves with a quiet confidence that bordered on arrogance. They weren't just soldiers, they were specialists, advisors, linguists, medics, and demolition experts all rolled into one. They operated in small, autonomous teams deep behind enemy lines. They were the army's tip of the spear. Benavidez was captivated. This was no place for a follower. This was a place for a warrior who could think and act for himself. The path to the Green Beret was notoriously difficult. The training was designed to break men, both physically and mentally. It was at the U.S. Army Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, that Benavidez's true character was forged in fire. He was pushed to his absolute limits during the Q course, qualification course. Long-range patrols with heavy rucksacks, survival training, advanced weapons handling, unconventional warfare tactics, and medical training. It was relentless. One story from his training became legend. During a grueling land navigation exercise in the swamps of North Carolina, Benavidez was bitten by a venomous snake. Most men would have signaled for help, but Benavidez, fearing he would fail the course, did something almost unthinkable. He took out his razor-sharp Bowie knife, sliced open the fang marks, sucked out the venom, applied a makeshift tourniquet, and completed the exercise. He stumbled back into camp hours later, his leg swollen and discolored, and collapsed. The medics were astounded. It was a level of sheer grit and determination that defied logic. This was not the action of a man simply trying to pass a test. It was the action of a man who would rather die than quit. He earned his Green Beret in 1961. It was more than just a piece of headgear, it was a symbol of everything he had overcome. The orphan from Cuero was now a member of one of the most elite fighting forces in the world. He was assigned to the 5th Special Forces Group and, in 1964, was deployed to South Vietnam for his first tour. It was here he began to learn the intricate, shadowy art of special operations in the jungle. He worked with Civilian Irregular Defense Group, CIDG soldiers, training them and leading them on patrols. He saw combat, learned the rhythms of the war, and honed his skills. He returned to the States in 1965, a seasoned, competent Special Forces operative. But his defining moment was still 3 years away. In 1968, during his second tour, his war almost ended before the legend began. While on a patrol, he stepped on a landmine. The explosion shredded his leg, embedding shrapnel deep into his flesh and bone. The medics told him he would never walk again. For months, he lay in a hospital bed at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio. Facing the very real prospect of a medical discharge and a lifetime of disability, the doctors wanted to amputate. Benavidez refused. The same stubbornness that had carried him through snake bites and special forces training now focused on a single goal. Walking, night after night, when the wards were quiet, he would drag himself out of bed. Gripping the rails, his body screaming in agony, sweat pouring from his brow, he would force himself to stand. He would take one step, then two, then collapse. The next night, he would do it again. He was relearning to walk through pure, unadulterated willpower. The nurses would find him on the floor in the morning, exhausted and in tears. But he was making progress. Against all odds, and to the utter amazement of his doctors, Roy Benavidez not only walked out of that hospital, he ran. He ran straight back to Vietnam, back to his unit, back to the war. He had a date with destiny in a place called Loc Ninh. Part 3, 6 Hours in Hell, the Battle at LZ Loc Ninh, which brings us back to that morning of May 2nd, 1968. The helicopter carrying Benavidez roared towards the coordinates, the sound of its engine drowned out by the growing thunder of battle ahead. As they approached the clearing, the scene below was apocalyptic. The small, oval-shaped landing zone was a cauldron of smoke and fire. Tracer rounds streaked in every direction. The jungle perimeter was alive with the muzzle flashes of hundreds of North Vietnamese Army NVA soldiers. The recon team was pinned down in the center, their numbers dwindling by the minute the pilot, Major McKibben, knew he couldn't land. The LZ was too hot. He would have to hover just a few feet off the ground. He yelled back at Benavidez, "You sure about this, Sergeant?" Benavidez didn't hear him. He was already at the door, his mind clear, his focus absolute. As the skids kissed the tall elephant grass, Benavidez leaped. It was not a jump into safety, but a sprint into the inferno. He hit the ground running and was immediately shot. A bullet tore through his leg, a searing white-hot pain. He ignored it. His training took over. He had to find the team leader and assess the situation. He crawled through the mud, the air buzzing with bullets like a swarm of angry hornets. He found Lieutenant Culland first. He was dead, shot through the head. The team's radio operator was also dead, his body riddled with bullets, the radio smashed. The team was cut off, leaderless, and unable to call for help. They were down to a handful of men, many of them wounded. Benavidez took charge. He wasn't the ranking soldier, but he was the one with the presence, the will, and the experience. He began dragging wounded men to a central location, a small depression in the ground that offered scant cover. He used his medical kit, tearing open field dressings and applying tourniquets, all while returning fire with his M16. He knew they had to get a radio. He remembered seeing a dead Air Force forward air controller, a Covey rider in the helicopter that had been shot down earlier. The wreckage was about 75 yards away, a lifetime of distance through a hail of gunfire. "Cover me," he yelled to the remaining team members, and he made a dash for it. He moved in a low, weaving crouch, bullets kicking up dirt at his heels. He reached the smoldering helicopter. The co-pilot was dead, but the pilot was still alive, though mortally wounded. Benavidez grabbed the pilot's AR-15 rifle and, crucially, the radio. As he turned to run back, an NVA soldier leapt from the jungle, aiming a bayonet at his chest. Benavidez didn't have time to aim. He swung the heavy radio, smashing it into the soldier's head, then finished him with his own knife. He sprinted back to the perimeter, the precious radio in hand. Now they could communicate. He called in air support. "Any station. This is Bayonet 6 Zulu. I'm at the crash site. We are surrounded and taking heavy fire. I need gunships and extraction now." Soon the sky filled with the beautiful, terrifying sound of American Air Power F-4 Phantom jets screamed overhead, dropping napalm that scorched the earth just meters from their position. The concussive blasts shaking the very ground attack helicopters, Huey Hogg gunships, swooped in, their miniguns hosing down the tree lines with 6,000 rounds per minute. But the NVA were not retreating. They were determined to wipe out the American team. During one desperate charge, Benavidez was shot in the abdomen. The pain was excruciating, but he kept fighting. He was now running on a mixture of adrenaline, training, and pure rage. He moved from man to man, distributing ammunition, treating wounds, and shouting words of encouragement. He was a whirlwind, a constant defiant presence in the middle of the storm. The battle devolved into a series of close-range, savage encounters. At one point, an NVA soldier charged his position with a fixed bayonet. Benavidez, out of ammunition for his rifle, met the charge with his bowie knife. It was a brutal, primal struggle in the mud. The soldier was bigger, but Benavidez was fueled by a ferocity born of desperation. He killed the soldier, but not before taking a deep bayonet wound to his own arm. Later, a grenade landed in the middle of the wounded men. Without a second's hesitation, Benavidez kicked it away, but it detonated, sending shrapnel tearing into his back, legs, and head. He was blinded in one eye by the blast and felt a piece of metal lodge in his skull. He was now deaf in one ear, half blind, and bleeding from more than 24 wounds. He could feel his strength ebbing, the darkness closing in. He began to pray, not for salvation, but for the strength to save just one more man. For 6 hours, this nightmare continued. Benavidez was shot, stabbed, blown up, and beaten, but he never stopped. He called in airstrikes so close that the shrapnel from the American bombs fell on their position. He directed helicopter gunship fire onto NVA soldiers who were mere feet away. He was a conductor of a symphony of destruction, and the instruments were jets, helicopters, and his own indomitable spirit. Finally, an extraction helicopter, a larger Jolly Green Giant, managed to fight its way to the LZ. It was their only chance. Benavidez, now barely able to walk, began the Herculean task of loading the wounded. He dragged, carried, and pushed the surviving team members toward the chopper. As he was helping the last man, he was shot in the back. The bullet exited through his lung. He collapsed, his body finally giving out. He lay in the mud, watching as the helicopter, packed with the men he had saved, began to lift off. He believed his job was done. He was at peace. But the crew chief, looking down, saw this broken, bloody man move a hand. He yelled to the pilot, "There's one more. He's alive." The pilot, displaying incredible bravery, settled the helicopter back down. 2 crew members jumped out, ran to Benavidez, and dragged his limp, shredded body aboard. As they lifted off for the final time, the jungle below was still erupting with enemy fire. Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez, his mission accomplished, lost consciousness. Part 4, The Body Bag and the Spit of Defiance. The helicopter raced back to the field hospital at the base in Ninh. The interior was a scene of carnage. The air was thick with the smell of blood, cordite, and sweat. The wounded men were silent, in shock. Benavidez lay in a heap, unmoving. He was covered in a thick layer of dried blood and mud. He had a gaping head wound, his abdomen was torn open, and he had so many bullet and shrapnel holes that it was impossible to count them all at a glance. He wasn't breathing. There was no pulse. When they unloaded the casualties, a young medic took one look at Benavidez and shook his head. He was clearly gone. There was no point in wasting precious medical resources on a corpse. In the grim, efficient triage of a combat hospital, he was categorized as KIA, killed in action. To prevent the spread of disease and to prepare the bodies for transport, he was zipped into a black rubber body bag and laid aside with the other dead. Some time later, a doctor was making his rounds, checking the wounded and confirming the deceased. He came to the bag containing Benavidez. As he started to unzip it to formally pronounce death, he saw something that made him pause. The corpse inside was a horrific sight, but the doctor noticed a faint bubbling froth of blood around the lips. It was a sign of a sucking chest wound, an injury incompatible with life for a dead man who wasn't breathing. Just then, the body in the bag twitched. Roy Benavidez was drifting in a black, silent void. The only thing tethering him to life was a searing, all-consuming pain. He felt a pressure on his chest, a coolness on his skin. He sensed a presence. In his semi-conscious state, his training and instincts screamed one thing: VC Viet Cong. The enemy is trying to strip my body. It was the ultimate dishonor. He would not allow it. He had to let them know he was still an American soldier, that he was still fighting. He gathered every last microjoule of energy left in his shattered body. He focused on the sensation near his face. With a monumental effort, he forced his lungs and throat to work. He couldn't speak. He couldn't scream. But he could manage one final defiant act. He spat. A weak, bloody spittle landed directly on the doctor's face. The doctor jumped back, startled, then leaned in close. "My God," he whispered, "this man's alive?" The medical team sprang into action. They ripped open the body bag and rushed Benavidez into surgery. The doctors worked for hours, picking shrapnel from his body, repairing his lung, stitching his countless wounds. They lost count at 37 separate injuries. They were certain he would not survive the night. But they didn't know Roy Benavidez. He had already cheated death once on the battlefield, and he was not about to let it take him on an operating table. He clung to life with the same tenacity he had shown in the jungle. Part 5. The long road home and the fight for recognition. The physical recovery was another long, agonizing battle. He spent nearly a year in various military hospitals, undergoing multiple surgeries. The doctors told him he would be permanently disabled, that he would never walk without a crippling limp, that his military career was over. Once again, Benavidez defied the predictions. Through sheer force of will and months of painful physical therapy, he learned to walk again. He even managed to run, albeit with a pronounced rolling gait that became his signature. But a different battle was just beginning. The battle for recognition. The men he had saved knew what he had done. They told their story, a story so incredible that many in the Pentagon dismissed it as a barroom tale. An exaggeration born of the fog of war. The initial after-action reports were incomplete. The officers who wrote them hadn't been on the ground. They couldn't comprehend the one-man rescue operation Benavidez had orchestrated. The Army initially awarded Benavidez the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second-highest award for valor. It was a great honor, but every man who was at Ninh knew it wasn't enough. They knew Benavidez had done something that transcended the criteria for any medal. He had performed actions that resided in the realm of myth. For years, Benavidez said nothing. He was a quiet, humble man. He returned to his family, raised his children, and continued to serve in the Army in a training capacity until his retirement in 1976. He never boasted. He never complained. But one of the men he saved, Brian O'Connor, did. O'Connor, who had been paralyzed in the battle, made it his mission to see Benavidez receive the Medal of Honor. He wrote letters, he gathered statements, he badgered officials. He knew that without Benavidez, he and 7 other men would have died in that clearing. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a journalist. In 1980, a writer for the Washington Post got wind of the story and published a detailed account of the battle, highlighting the discrepancy between the eyewitness reports and the official recognition. The article caused a public outcry. Pressure mounted on the Army to reinvestigate. The Army, skeptical but compelled, launched a full review. They re-interviewed every surviving witness, including the helicopter pilots and the doctor who had been spat upon. The evidence was overwhelming and consistent. Every story corroborated the next, painting a picture of almost supernatural courage and endurance. The Pentagon, which had once called the story impossible, was forced to concede that it was, in fact, true. On February 24, 1981, more than 12 years after the battle, Roy P. Benavidez was summoned to the Pentagon. He was told he was there to receive an upgrade to his Distinguished Service Cross from the Secretary of Defense. He stood at attention in his dress uniform, his body still bearing the scars of his wounds, as Secretary Caspar Weinberger began to read the citation. But as Weinberger read, Benavidez realized the language was wrong. It wasn't the language of the DSC, it was the language of the Medal of Honor. He was in a state of shock as President Ronald Reagan walked into the room. The president had orchestrated the surprise. As Reagan placed the light blue ribbon around his neck, he turned to the assembled press corps and said, "If the story of his heroism were a movie script, you would not believe it." He then looked at Benavidez and simply said, "You really deserve this." At long last, the orphan from Cuero, the soldier they had zipped in a body bag, had received the nation's highest military honor. The fight was over. The record was set straight. Roy P. Benavidez lived for another 17 years after receiving the Medal of Honor. He never sought the spotlight, but he used his status to inspire young people, particularly Hispanic youth. He traveled the country, telling his story not as a tale of killing, but as a story of saving, of loyalty, and of never ever giving up. His message was simple. You can do anything you set your mind to. Look at me. I was an orphan. I was a dropout. But I set goals, and I refused to quit. He died on November 29, 1998, at the age of 63. He was buried with full military honors at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery in San Antonio. The man who had been left for dead was now immortalized as a national hero. His legacy is multifaceted. He is a symbol of almost unimaginable courage, a case study in the outer limits of human endurance and willpower. His story is a testament to the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood forged in combat. But perhaps most importantly, Roy P. Benavidez is a powerful American archetype, the underdog who, through sheer force of character, rises to become the greatest of heroes. He was a man who looked certain death in the face, not once, but countless times in a single afternoon, and spat back in defiance. The spit in the doctor's face was more than just a signal that he was alive. It was the essence of Roy Benavidez, a final, gritty, uncompromising refusal to surrender. The heart of a hero was indeed still beating, and its echo continues to inspire long after it has fallen silent.